Okay, here we go. So, I'll be going over this particular paper. Well, it's not really a paper, it's more like commentary in the Elsevier Public Health Emergency Collection. And it'll be SARS-CoV-2 induced respiratory distress. Can cannabinoids be added to antiviral therapies to reduce lung inflammation? So, it appears as though lung inflammation is one of the worst parts of contracting COVID-19, or I should say contracting SARS-CoV-2, which results in COVID-19. And it appears as though that one of the major complications of contracting this disease is having a dysregulation of your immune system. So, and causing excessive inflammation in the entire process. So, coronavirus disease 2019, caused by severe acute respiratory syndrome coronavirus 2, has emerged as a global pandemic which was first reported in Wuhan, China. Recent reports have suggested that acute infection is associated with a cytokine superstorm. So, a cytokine is just a hormone or a signaling molecule, and it tends to be the signaling molecules that are produced by the immune system to increase the amount of inflammation in a particular area. So that's why they call it a cytokine superstorm, because if it ends up becoming dysregulated or too much, then you basically have an autoimmune response that is too damaging for your body to recover easily from. So, which contributes to the symptoms of fever, cough, muscle pain, and in severe cases, bilateral interstitial pneumonia, characterized by ground glass opacity and focal chest infiltrates that can be visualized on a computerized tomography scans. So, bilateral interstitial pneumonia, it means that you can find the pneumonia on both sides of the lungs, which is pretty rare, actually. If you get pneumonia, usually and hopefully it's only in one lung, but since it's in both lungs, that can prove to be even more problematic. Currently, there are no effective antiviral drugs or vaccines against SARS-CoV-2. In the recent issue of BBI Zhang et al., thoroughly summarized the current status of potential therapeutic strategies for COVID-19. One of them, the anti-interleukin 6 receptor antibody, resulted in clearance of lung consolidation and recovery in 90% of the 21 treated patients. So here they have seen that if you have an antibody that can attack the receptor of one of the cytokines, then you can possibly effectively slow down the progression of the disease. So, and help with the recovery. Although promising, it has produced adverse effects like pancreatitis and hypertriglyceridemia. So they have noted that this antibody worked. It was effective at doing its job. However, it had a lot of side effects that some person might not want to ascribe those side effects by taking this particular antibody drug. Which makes it imperative to explore effective alternative anti-inflammatory strategies. Here, we intend to highlight the potential effects of cannabinoids, in particular the non-psychotropic cannabidiol, or CBD, that has shown beneficial anti-inflammatory effects in preclinical models of various chronic inflammatory diseases, and is FDA approved for seizure reduction in children with intractable epilepsy. So we have a FDA approved chemical, so it wouldn't have to go through a long, rigorous process of gaining FDA approval. And it's non-psychotropic, so it's not going to cause the same types of psychosis, or not psychosis, but the same psychological effects as THC might. So, continuing, like delta soup 9 tetrahydrocannabidiol, or cannabinol, or THC, the most well-studied cannabinoid, CBD decreases lung inflammation in a murine or a mouse model of acute lung injury, potentially through the inhibition of pro-inflammatory cytokine production by immune cells and suppressing exuberant immune responses. So in a mouse model with acute or sudden lung injury, their THC, or not THC, CBD, like THC, can reduce the inflammation caused by that. And they presume that the mechanism is through the inhibition of these pro-inflammatory cytokines. That hasn't been exactly proven by this lab yet, but it is a reasonable assumption to be made. Anyways, CBD can inhibit the production of pro-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin IL-2, IL-6, IL-alpha, beta, interferon gamma, inducible protein, and monocyte chemoattractive protein. These are all different types of cytokines. Just keep that in mind. That have been associated with SARS-CoV-2 induced multi-organ pathology and mortality. In a mouse model of chronic asthma, CBD reduced pro-inflammatory cytokine production, airway inflammation, and fibrosis. So given a mouse model that has chronic asthma, so they probably genetically engineered it or bred it to always have asthma, if they are administered CBD, I shouldn't say, they might have also done some sort of chemical treatment to give this mouse chronic asthma. Regardless, CBD reduced pro-inflammatory cytokine production and basically helped stop a lot of the negative side effects of always having this inflammatory response going on in this asthmatic mouse. Moreover, CBD can effectively inhibit the JAK-STAT pathway, so including the production and action of type 1 interferon without leading to addiction. So to go over this, what is the JAK-STAT pathway? So the JAK-STAT pathway is a signaling pathway. So when your body is producing chemicals to signal to other cells nearby, the way that those signals work is the chemical has to somehow interact with a signaling pathway of that cell. And so I'll read this. The JAK-STAT signaling pathway is a chain of interactions between proteins in a cell and is involved in processes such as immunity, cell division, cell death, and tumor formation. The pathway communicates information from chemical signals outside the cell to the cell nucleus, resulting in the activation of genes through a process called transcription. So you have your cell, and your cell has the nucleus, and the nucleus has the DNA inside of it. And the DNA has the information to make you. Now, the way that this information from the DNA gets outside is it is transcribed from DNA into RNA first. And so you go from DNA transcribed into RNA, and that process is called transcription. And then that RNA then gets translated into proteins. And that process is called translation. So the activation of genes through a process called transcription, as the signal gets transduced into the nucleus of the cell, that process of transcription into RNA can get regulated. So certain genes can get upregulated. And by upregulating the amount of RNA that is transcribed, you end up downstream producing more of those proteins or more of those chemical signals as well. So there are three parts of the JAK-STAT signaling, and the first one is the Janus Kinases, or the JAKs. So just so you know, a kinase is a protein or an enzyme that likes to put on phosphates or phosphate groups onto other chemicals or proteins. And the other part is the signal transducer and activator of transcription proteins, or STATs. And biochemists love our acronyms, so we just call them STATs. So it's something that transduces a signal and activates the transcription of proteins, so the transcription going from the DNA into RNA, so it can activate that process for certain genes. So, and if you have disruption in this, it can cause a lot of conditions such as skin cancer, cancers, disorders, and conditions, and it also affects the immune system negatively. So, here is a visual of the process. So, this is your cell right here in the yellow tan color. This is inside of the cell, and this blue part is outside of the cell. So you have all over the cell membrane these receptors, and you have many, many different types of receptors for different types of chemicals. And you have many of each one of these receptors, and certain cells will have different receptors. But in this particular case, this is the cytokine receptor, or a general cytokine receptor. And connected to these receptors are your JAKs, or your Janus Kinases. So what ends up happening is, let's say an immune cell has been triggered and is now producing cytokines. And so here you have a cytokine that is produced, and if it is floating around outside of the cell, it might come in and fit snugly into this cytokine receptor. And when the cytokine receptor has the cytokine inside of it, then that signals to the JAK, oh, it's time to put in a phosphate. So it ends up putting in a phosphate on the cytokine receptor. And since it's a dimer in this case, there is one put on each side. So these stats that these signal transducers, these stats, are always floating around within the cell. And sometimes they are floating around and then they will bump into this receptor. And if there's no phosphate here, the receptor isn't the right shape, and so it just bounces off. However, if there is a phosphate there and it bumps into it, then it'll stick to the receptor. So if it sticks to the receptor, then this activated JAK is still wanting to put phosphates on stuff. So it ends up putting a phosphate on the stat itself. Now, following this process, it will then randomly come off. And then now that the stat has a phosphate on it, it's now very easy for the stat to interact with itself. And then when it interacts with itself, it ends up making a dimer of the stat. And then this dimer is the activated form of the stat. And so it is able to go into the nucleus where it can affect transcription. And by affecting transcription, it ends up downstream affecting translation. It ends up affecting the number of proteins that are being produced. So this is how the signal is transduced from a cytokine from a completely different cell very far away. This is how that signal can get into the DNA of its target cell. So going back here, CBD can effectively inhibit the JAK-STAT pathway. So what they're saying is, without including the production and action of type 1 interferons. So the type 1 interferons are just one of the types of cytokines. So going back here, they're arguing that CBD is able to not only prevent this cytokine from forming in the first place, but it can somehow interact with one of the processes in this pathway, which, if you can dampen any one of these processes, you are dampening the signal even more. And what I should also mention is this entire process, a lot of times there's a positive feedback loop. So once a cytokine gets in and sends its signal all the way down to the nucleus, well, in the nucleus of the nearby cell, the transcription that takes place, or the effects of this signal, can result in the production of more cytokines. Either directly if it is within another white blood cell, or indirectly by creating inflammation, and by creating inflammation, you are signaling to more white blood cells to produce more cytokines. So if you can dampen the production, or if you can dampen any of these signaling steps, then you are slowing down that positive feedback loop. So continuing, um, so CBD has the ability to have action on the type 1 interferons, and also without leading to addiction, alterations in the heart rate or blood pressure, and adverse effects on the gastrointestinal tract and cognition. So in contrast to THC, which does have more notable effects on these individual symptoms, CBD does not have that to the same degree, or not at all, according to this commentary. In simian immunodeficiency virus, or SIV, infected I don't know how to pronounce that, but RMs, we reported, and this is just a monkey model, we reported that THC-mediated attenuation of INF, which is one of the cytokines, stimulated gene expression in the intestines. So what they're saying is, when a monkey is infected with SIV, they are producing these cytokines in the intestines. But THC is able to attenuate or slow down, stop, inhibit that process to a degree. Similar to CBD, chronic THC administration blocked inflammation-induced fibrosis in lymph nodes of chronically SIV-infected rheus monkeys. So they're saying here, not only does THC affect the IFNs, or these cytokines, from being produced, it's also affecting the symptomology or the pathology of SIV-infected rheus monkeys over long periods of time. So, unlike THC, though, CBD has a high margin of safety and is well tolerated, pharmacologically, even after treatment of up to 150 milligrams per day for 2 weeks in both animals and humans. So this is something that we really like to see in drug design, is that if it is well tolerated, or if you can have a lot of it without any negative side effects, short-term or long-term, these types of chemicals are, really, really beneficial to have, because they are better to use as prophylactics if they have very little side effects, or they're easy to take, because if you have a drug that causes a lot of symptoms or side effects, it could be very difficult to have the patient continue to take the drug, because if they take the drug and they feel bad whenever they take the drug, then there's discouragement of taking the drug in those dosages, but here they're saying large dosages, and this is a pharmacologically relevant dose, so it's going to have action on the body, but it is well tolerated even at that high dosage. So this suggests its feasibility to reduce SARS-CoV-2 induced lung inflammation or pathology and disease severity. So here, SARS-CoV-2 entry via inhalation. When you see, so here you have the CBD and THC plus CBD, and here whenever you see this symbol with the line and then the parallel line, that means it is inhibiting or lowering the thing on the opposite side of that line. So here they're saying CBD THC is effective at attenuating or slowing down or reducing anxiety, which is true at the proper dosages. If you get too much, you can definitely become a little bit more anxious if you are taking THC especially. But so they're saying here, if someone breathes the virus and it's getting into the lungs, the macrophages and the neutrophils are going to start doing their thing, because it's their job to remove viruses, and it's also their job to signal to the rest of the body that there's something bad going on here. So it ends up producing these cytokines. And this is very important for your body to do, especially in the beginning stages of um, especially in the beginning stages of a virus infecting your body. You want to get on top of the issue before the virus ends up spreading too much, too far and too wide. And the interleukins are specific to viral infection, if I remember correctly. Oh, and some of the other signals that they make are reactive oxygen species. So a lot of white blood cells will actually produce reactive oxygen species, or I believe a lot of them are free radicals, except don't quote me on that. And if I remember as well, they sodium or hypochlorite might also be another reactive oxygen species that white blood cells make, but don't quote me on that. Basically, it's producing some form of uh, bleach, if you will. But this is also a signal to the cells nearby that crap is going down. So what they're saying here is that CBD and THC are known to inhibit the production of these cellular signals. Now, you can go on and off as to whether that is a good thing or not, but it is effective at doing that. But it is definitely good for the chronic issues after the fact, or if you're in the latter stage of fighting this virus off. But at least in the beginning stages, before this process has become dysregulated, there is at least some use for these cytokines to be produced because they're activating your immune system. But it also causes damage. So CBD and THC, by inhibiting this, it is also inhibiting the inflammation, inhibiting the pneumonia, because sometimes the inflammation can cause water to fill up your alveolar sacs. And then sometimes it can also cause the death of the epithelial cells of the alveoli, or the small sacs in the lungs. So by inhibiting that process, you could inhibit the amount of damage being done to your body. And if you can inhibit that, then you can also inhibit the lung injury and fibrosis, or some of the scarring that is happening. You can inhibit that as well. And you can also inhibit oxidative stress as well. So continuing down, 22. There are the many uncertainties associated with COVID-19 pandemic, such as status of the economy, employment, and loss of connection can fuel depression, fear, and anxiety. CBD has shown promise as an alternative therapy for the clinical management of anxiety disorders. So they're saying here, it's not just the physical crap that you have to deal with, it's also the emotional toll of going through a pandemic. And so CBD might be able to affect that, affect those symptoms as well. Based on its anxiolytic and antidepressant properties, so destruction of anxiety and antidepressant properties, it has been suggested that CBD could be used to improve the mental and somatic, or body, the brain and body health of patients suffering from anxiety and emotional stress after recovering from Ebola disease. Like Ebola, patients recovering from COVID-19 may experience various psychological and social stressors that may be triggered by residual chronic inflammation and autoimmune reactions. So I need to also stress that when it came to the first SARS epidemic and MERS, a lot of people who had contracted SARS had experienced long-term mental illnesses. At least, if I remember correctly, 30 months after the fact, half of people who did not have a mental illness before contracting it ended up having one after the fact. Long term, 30 months down the road. So, what needs to be really needs to be considered, oh, is what needs to be considered is a lot, especially with SARS, a lot of them lost family members. So if they survived, because of how transmissible SARS was, then they probably lost a loved one, and so that can definitely cause psychological stressors. But some other issues as well is the if there is some long-term inflammation or autoimmune responses that can also have negative effects on the psyche as well. So if you have an autoimmune disorder and you aren't able to do everything that you wanted to do, or all the things that are under the umbrella of self-care, then that can cause a lasting psychological effect on that particular person. Especially with SARS, there was also social stigmatization of people who contracted it, so that could also affect their mental state. And so CBD might be able to, at least for the purely psychological portions, might be able to affect or benefit the people who suffer from that. Um, but then there might also be another effect with the autoimmune disorders that can possibly result after the fact. So, or the inflammation. Continuing, therefore, randomized clinical trials to test the efficacy of CBD on alleviating anxiety and fear associated with COVID-19 infection and its consequences on people's physical, social, and psychological well being may be beneficial in the future. So, they're saying here is, it could be a positive feedback loop. So, if something helps you physically, if something helps you socially, then it could also help you psychologically. And if it can positively affect any one of these, oftentimes by improving one, you end up creating the conditions to help improve the others. So if you can help someone physically, um, being able to go out and about a lot more frequently. So if that gets benefited, then some people might have more confidence so they can socialize more, or that ends up boding well for their psychology. So that is one way. Or if someone, is benefited socially, then they might go out more and they might be able to, go rock wall climbing with more friends, or they're able to go hiking with friends. They're able to do more social events that result in them being more physical and going outside more. So these three definitely interplay, and if you can benefit even just one of them, you're going to benefit all of them. Additionally, severely ill COVID-19 patients exhibited neurological symptoms like cerebrovascular disease, headache, and disturbed consciousness. So, brain edema or brain swelling, neuronal degeneration, and the presence of SARS-CoV-2 in the cerebrospinal fluid, or CSF, were confirmed at autopsy. So, what they're saying here is that with SARS-CoV-2, we have seen symptoms in pathology that affect the nervous system directly. And so we are worried that if something affects the nervous system, then you can have neurological or psychological effects from it. So therefore, a longitudinal cerebrospinal fluid sampling using non-human primates studies may help clarify whether and when SARS-CoV-2 invades the brain, and if it happens, does it result in neuroinflammation, and more importantly, whether cannabinoids can modulate these effects. So since we know cannabinoids can help lower inflammation and they can affect the inflammatory response in a good way, or I should say in a suppressive way, because sometimes suppressing inflammation isn't always good, but if you are overinflamed, suppressing it is a good thing. So what we're worried about is if neuroinflammation is happening, then cannabinoids might prove to be a good treatment at preventing or at least attenuating the effects of the inflammation. And here they want to use it in a non-human primate, and because you can do more experiments on a monkey than you can on a human, and there's a little bit more control as far as what outside factors are happening to that monkey versus a human. And they want to do a longitudinal study because longitudinal studies they're great. They're great information because you are following the same the same person or the same creature throughout the course of its life. And so it's really hard sometimes if you are trying to do long-term studies, but you're doing the studies of different groups of people at different points in time. You might be able to recreate what a long-term effect is, but the problem is that data is a lot noisier. So, but if you can find one person or one creature and you can follow their disease progression for the course of their life, and if you do this with multiple samples, that data should be a lot less noisy, and you can infer a lot more things from that data than a typical study. Continuing, being a negative allosteric modulator of the cannabinoid receptor, CBD can counter the psychotropic effects of THC when co-administered with THC. So what they're saying here is CBD can help prevent THC from getting you high, which is one of the reasons that with breeding these days, breeding often lowers the production, I should say, breeding of the marijuana plants. Uh, Oftentimes, we breed them so that they produce a lot more THC and a lot less CBD, especially if we're wanting to make marijuana that's pretty effective. So, and one of the causes of that is CBD can counter the effects of THC. So if you want to be able to get some THC in people for some sort of pharmaceutical reason, then adding CBD is usually or is pretty important, because then these people are not going to be experiencing as much of the psychotropic effects of THC, and that's because CBD can bind into the same receptor and allosterically modulate it, which means it changes the shape of the cannabinoid receptor. Continuing, although remdesivir reduced the mortality rate of seriously ill COVID-19 patients needing invasive ventilation, similar studies in rheus macaques revealed minimal subpleural inflammatory and cellular infiltrates in the lungs of clinically recovered remdesivir-treated rheus monkeys at necropsy. So this suggests persistence of inflammation and may partly explain the 20 to 30% reduction in lung function in COVID-19 patients after recovery. So people who have become critically ill can have reduced lung function for at least a significant portion of time, which, if it's left unresolved, may lead to pulmonary fibrosis, scarring. So collectively, these findings support the investigation of cannabinoids as a plausible option to be added as an adjunct or to remdesivir or any new antivirals on SARS-CoV-2 induced lung inflammation. And this was happening when remdesivir was showing a little bit more promise, which is why it was included in this commentary. But obviously, it doesn't have to be remdesivir. It could be any new antiviral that ends up being beneficial for COVID-19. So they're saying if whatever antivirals you're adding, you might want to also include adding something that is anti-inflammatory as well, and especially if it can target the inflammation of the lungs. So anyways, this work was supported, and yeah, that's pretty much everything, and here are the references if you want to look at them. But I guess my thoughts are it probably is beneficial to be administering CBD, and it probably throughout history, we often find these chemicals in nature and then breed them because they cause positive effects for us throughout history. And so it makes sense that if these chemicals are causing benefit to society, So, for instance, viruses, this isn't the first pandemic to ever happen. Pandemics have come through many, many times before. But if there are certain people groups that are taking chemicals that, even recreationally, if they're taking these chemicals recreationally and it's a common thing in their culture, if they are taking chemicals that can make them survive a pandemic with a higher percentage, then that means that they are going to survive and their culture is going to be able to propagate a little bit better than cultures that do not take a protective chemical. So the fact that marijuana is such a um, if it's not regulated out of existence, if it just exists in a population, there will be a good number of cultures that use marijuana recreationally. And this can and if marijuana did have some protective aspects to it, to their people groups, whenever these pandemics would come through, it would kill. I shouldn't say kill, but it would suppress the populations of nearby cultures that did not allow marijuana, while preserving, at least to a degree, the ones that did. So, I mean, this would just be coming from an evolutionary perspective. This would probably be one of the reasons why uh, we have evolved to be somewhat addicted to cannabinoids, because if they are protecting us in some degree, the people who are getting somewhat attached, I shouldn't say addicted, but they're getting attached to cannabinoids, then that means that they and their progeny are going to be more likely to be taking this chemical. And if this chemical has a protective effect, then their lines, their lineages are going to be more spared from pandemics or other diseases, epidemics that happen. So that's pretty much all that I want to say about this. That this should definitely be looked into, and I guess we can look to Colorado and Washington to see if the effects of CBD or THC are actually providing, a protective role in people. So that is it. So thanks for coming. Please, if there were any questions, leave them down. I'll try to get to them later. And if, yeah, I think that's pretty much it. So thanks for coming.